In Disney California Adventure, there is a small, often overlooked attraction known as the Boudin Sourdough Bakery Tour. It opened with the park and was located in the area known as Pacific Wharf, which, while essentially just a large outdoor cafeteria, was themed to the waterfront districts of Monterey and San Francisco. While early California Adventure was widely critiqued for its cheap facades, tacky artistic vision, and lack of quality rides, I do personally find its original theme to at least be conceptually interesting, celebrating the culture and landscapes of California. While you often see the question posed online, why build a park themed to California in California? I do think that the narrative would have been very different if a lot more money and quality attractions went into the park on opening, with people instead praising how such a strange idea could only be pulled off by Disney. That's not the focus of this video, because I have one from a few years ago where I discussed California Adventure's early history and proposed my own solutions for how it could have been fixed. But the point is that despite its many major shortcomings, I still very much appreciated the original theme and how it drew from history and culture. On top of that, the original park was also lightly educational, with the wine country themed area hosting a film titled Seasons of the Vine, taking visitors through the process found in California vineyards. Other areas, such as Bountiful Valley Farm, taught visitors about other aspects of California agriculture, and in the Bay Area, a film known as Golden Dreams broadly presented the history of the state. The original concept behind the show was something ambitious with animatronics, similar in scale to something like The American Adventure, but even so, I appreciate that the park was tying that educational aspect into the culture it was based around. This brings us back to Pacific Wharf and the bakery tour, which, while not much, takes you through the process of making bread, or in this case, Boudin's San Francisco sourdough. Again, it's not much, and people generally go in there just for free samples of bread, but I appreciate that it wanted to teach park guests about something, even if it wasn't the most exciting topic. Located in the building opposite where the Ghirardelli chocolate shop now occupies, the park opens with the Mission Tortilla Factory, which presented you with something similar, brought to you by Mission Foods. You could look into small windows where you could witness small scenes of tortilla production, achieved through video and a Pepper's Ghost effect. And walking further in, you could view machinery and actual tortillas made for the park, similar to the bakery tour. The only remaining educational attraction in California Adventure, at least for now, is the bakery tour, and the rest of Pacific Wharf is technically gone, rethemed with a bad overlay and turned into San Francisco from Big Hero 6. Other than the abysmally cheap quality and ugliness of this new area, San Francisco and the erasure of culture pretty much sums up how Disney leadership views their park guests today. They don't trust you to find an experience interesting unless there's a character or franchise haphazardly slapped onto it, and as is often the case now, it's done as cheaply as possible, with no thought for how incredibly tacky these kind of choices are. The current mandate of shoving intellectual property into the parks doesn't just destroy the theming that once defined the Disney experience, which is what got them to the top in the first place, but it also reveals that leadership views its park guests as, well, dumb. Perhaps they're not wrong, because when San Francisco was officially revealed, I lost count of how many people commented on it all over the internet, screaming "amazing" in all caps, which they'll pretty much do on Reddit or Twitter for anything that Disney changes or introduces in its parks, regardless of the quality. Disney could probably buy out a Six Flags park, repaint the roller coasters with Disney characters, and you would still have this weird, small demographic that would hype it up as the best thing ever done, which as a theme park fan, I find highly unfortunate because it rewards the company with positive feedback for its often awful decisions. Anyways, back to topic. Today I wanted to take a historical look at Disney parks, specifically the educational aspect that has pervaded them ever since the opening of Disneyland in 1955. There's a lot to cover, so I won't go too far into depth with any one experience, but please join me today as we explore an era where Disney trusted you to, well, actually learn something, and genuinely have fun while doing it. From opening, Disneyland definitely had an educational angle to it. While it may not have been as overt as later projects like Epcot Center or Disney MGM Studios, and still played a core role in its earliest days. Now, in fairness, fantasy is the primary element of the park, not just with Fantasyland, but with the mythologized American frontier of Frontierland, or the exotic jungles of Adventureland. Even Main Street was a fantasy, creating an idealized and perfect small-town America. When speaking of Disneyland's earliest years, though, education played a large role in the park, and an example of this is the Indian Village. Now, by today's standards, this does look ignorant or even exploitative, with Disneyland hiring actual Native Americans to perform cultural dances as a form of entertainment. I don't know enough about what was being performed to know whether it was authentic or not, and I can't speak on the feelings of the performers, but despite possible insensitivity, I do believe that the intent came from a good place. While an article on yesterworld.com does confirm that it did have elements that are definitely seen as ignorant or offensive today, for example, gendering the bathrooms using the terms braves and squaws, the village was mostly designed to authentically reflect traditions of various American tribes, and you could purchase real products crafted from tribal vendors. Native Americans were encouraged to share cultural traditions with guests, and one of the performers, Truman Washington Daly, was one of the last speakers of the language Oto Missouri, sharing it with curious guests in the park. Also, in another article from the site, I found an excerpt from the park's early magazine, Disneyland Holiday, that describes the area like this. One of the founding principles upon which Disneyland was designed was the preservation of our American heritage. This principle may be seen in many of the free shows and exhibits in each of Disneyland's realms, and one of the most popular among many free performances is the preservation of Indian traditions and customs in Frontierland's Indian Village. From this excerpt, it's clear to me that a sincere goal of the area was educating Americans on Native traditions, and even the phrase, the preservation of our American heritage, implies a reverence for its cultural legitimacy and respect as an element of broader American history. In 1962, Stouffer's Tahitian Terrace opened in Adventureland as a dinner show, and while dishes such as teriyaki steak were not really authentic to the Pacific Islands theme of the venue, the cultural dances and expressions of the performers certainly were. While the restaurant did sort of lump in many different cultures together in a Pacific Island theme, the World of Color episode that showcases the venue does make an effort to let you know that these performances are real, implying the intent to educate the audience. Moving on to very early Tomorrowland, the original iteration was very much focused on actual science and its application, with the only science fiction elements being a small exhibit on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Early Tomorrowland was designed almost like a mini World's Fair, and attractions included corporate showcases such as the Monsanto Hall of Chemistry, which taught about the miracle of turning raw material into plastics. Other corporate exhibits included the Crane Company's Bathroom of Tomorrow, which seems pretty self-explanatory, and the Kaiser Aluminum Hall of Fame, showcasing the new and innovative uses for this flexible metal, including this novelty aluminum telescope that led into the exhibit. While corporate showcases came and went, another early standout was the Monsanto House of the Future, utilizing plastic and novelty mechanical systems to portray the convenience and leisure of the future dwelling. The first year of park operation introduced Circarama, a new and innovative type of standing 360 theater that achieved its novel effect through a circle of multiple screens. The theater played a few different films over its lifetime, although the majority were focused on educating people by showcasing American landscapes, almost like an early conceptual predecessor to Soarin' Over California. Another early attraction was Rocket to the Moon, which, while not the most accurate in its portrayal of eventual travel to the moon, was at least based in real science. The attraction isn't documented very well, but guests sat in a circular theater designed to look like a rocket, watching a large screen disguised as a porthole as the theater simulated blasting off from Earth and landing on the moon. Autopia, while not explicitly educational in any sense, was meant to showcase the future of American car travel through the new and novel American highway system, and later, with the Tomorrowland expansion of 1959, the same idea applies with the monorail and the submarine voyage. In 1967, another futuristic method of transport was introduced with the People Mover, which pretty much coincided with the opening of Adventure Through Inner Space. I've talked about this attraction in a dedicated video before, speaking about its conveyance of existential horror as you continue shrinking to the atomic level, but at the very least, it does qualify as educational, taking you through the different components of an atom. It's also worth noting that its post-ride area included another display by Monsanto, continuing to showcase the use of plastic, as they were an early sponsor of this ride. For the 1964 New York World's Fair, Disney was contracted to create 4 separate attractions for various pavilions that eventually made their way to Disneyland. the Ford Magic Skyway, which did lean into the fantastical side of things, as it brought you through animatronic scenes of dinosaurs and Ice Age Homo sapiens, wasn't really educational, although many of its elements would later go on to inspire the educational attractions of early Epcot. It's a Small World was developed for a UNICEF pavilion sponsored by Pepsi, and while it doesn't teach anything other than its message of world peace, it does at least draw from the real world, almost becoming a cultural scavenger hunt, which I do think has some educational value. The Carousel of Progress was developed for General Electric, and while it did originally showcase their products, there is a lot of value in spinning through the decades, seeing how technology has changed and generally improved the American way of life. Finally, Disney worked with the State of Illinois Pavilion to develop Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, bringing the former president back to life and combining famous moments from some of his speeches into a reverent and powerful performance. All of the World's Fair attractions made their way back to Disneyland after the fair, some with more elements intact than others, but Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln continues to run to this day, with the show having been expanded and edited to retain and enhance its educational value. So that's a fair amount of educational material that you can find throughout the history of Disneyland, which really is more focused on the fantastical elements than anything else. Still, from this point though, the parks only continue to become more interesting, so let's move on to the Magic Kingdom. In the earliest years of Disneyland history, a few different concepts were thrown around for expansions off of Main Street, including Edison Square, which helped inspire the Carousel of Progress, and International Street, which is cited as early inspiration for Epcot's World Showcase. Another early concept was the colonial-themed Liberty Street, which would have been anchored by a show that featured America's presidents and was originally titled One Nation Under God. However, the technology was not really there to produce the show, which later led to Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln as a proof of concept. When the Magic Kingdom went into development though, the Liberty Street plans were expanded and built as Liberty Square, which in my opinion is one of Magic Kingdom's most underrated aspects. Sure, its anchor attraction of the Haunted Mansion is great, but I also appreciate the colonial architecture and the many references to early American history. For example, if you look up into one of the windows, you'll see two lanterns referencing the ride of Paul Revere. Near the center of the square, you'll find a replica of the Liberty Bell, which was introduced in 1987 to celebrate the bicentennial of the presentation of the American Constitution, and is surrounded by the flags of the original 13 colonies. Adjacent to this is the Liberty Tree, which, while oak, is inspired by an elm tree in Boston that served as a meeting place for the Sons of Liberty, but later became a symbol of rebellion against the monarchy. In Liberty Square, the Liberty Tree has 13 hanging lanterns, representing of course the original colonies. Other details include the sagging shutters, with hinges painted black to convey the idea that they're made of leather, as metal needed to be conserved for the war effort against the British. If you've ever heard or observed these elements of Liberty Square, then you may have heard a few additional ones as well. For example, there are no bathrooms in the land except in the restaurants, which includes Columbia Harbor House and Liberty Tree Tavern. The fun fact about this is that since there was no plumbing in the colonial period, there are no bathrooms, and that inside the restaurants, their actual bathrooms are placed so that they technically exist in other lands. This is outright false if you have any degree of observational skills, and in the same vein, another fun fact about the land is that the brown accent along the pathway is meant to represent house dwellers throwing the contents of their chamber pots out into the street, which I think is also absurd. Originally, this was cobblestone up until the late 90s, and was likely replaced to keep down maintenance costs and better accommodate parade floats. The brown, river-like appearance is likely just a coincidence, and exists to contrast with red concrete, although I think it's telling that Disney parks used to be so detailed and full of influences from real culture that people would actually believe this claim. When I think about an era of Disney when real-life history and culture was important, one of the best examples of this is in Liberty Tree Tavern. With the exception of the lobby, which is still nice, there are 6 distinctly themed areas of the restaurant, each representing a famous historical figure from the early history of the United States. For example, the Benjamin Franklin Room contains portraits, maps, props related to printing newspaper, and other miscellaneous items that represent him and the things he did. Other examples include replicas of bookplates produced by Paul Revere in his particular room, as well as Commander John Paul Jones having his room decorated with nautical effects that relate to his exploits. If you didn't pick up on it either, Columbia Harbor House is named after the first American ship to circumnavigate the globe, and as you would expect, you'll find many nautical and sailing references inside. The point I'm making about all of this is that while Liberty Square doesn't often directly educate you, the way it draws from real history and culture is itself a route to learning if you take the time to stop and notice the details. That's what I find fascinating about Liberty Square, because there is a thematic depth rooted in so many real stories, and you just don't get that with the intellectual property mandate, which doesn't trust you to enjoy anything without a popular character or franchise. Whether you enjoy Galaxy's Edge or not, it undeniably lacks the cultural and thematic depth of Liberty Square, which is itself an element of old Disney design that you just don't find any longer. Even the Haunted Mansion, which thematically is only tied to Liberty Square through its facade, does have a long history of ghost stories that inspired it, with a ton of cultural depth. I won't go into any of those fascinating details here, because, well, I already have an older video where I explored this topic, but it only reinforces that difference between older Disney and the company now run by Bob Iger. Of course, to finish up Liberty Square, I have to mention the Hall of Presidents, which itself is a fantastic show that manages to elevate and mythologize the political office without ever straying into partisanship. The actual show is in this case actually teaching you about the presidency, and manages to tastefully navigate American history while still acknowledging the darker moments. Walking into the lobby, you're greeted with the Great Seal of the United States, which while a lot of people online claim required an act of Congress for Disney to use, it's likely that this is a myth, but again stems from that culture of thematic exceptionalism of pre-Iger Disney. The lobby also contains portraits of some presidents, but also display cases of personal possessions from select presidents, providing a bit of insight into their personality and interests. Like the rest of Liberty Square, I find the Hall of Presidents to be an extremely underrated aspect of Magic Kingdom, and most important to the theme of this video, it clearly fits the pursuit of education in the Disney parks. By the way, if you made it this far into the video, I just want to ask you the favor of leaving a like. While I want to move on from Liberty Square, I should also quickly mention that it ties into a larger theme of American expansion west. The land obviously represents colonial America, but once you reach the Diamond Horseshoe, the architecture clearly changes, alluding to settling the west up to St. Louis. Officially entering Frontierland, the architecture emulates rock and log cabin structures of the Colorado Rockies, and proceeds into the architecture of the West, finishing with a Southwest Pueblo style at the end of Pecos Bill. Notably, the addresses on each building actually represent years that move forward in time as the architectural style changes, chronicling the American move west. Again, it's not explicitly educational, but it does have a thematic depth that sparks a bit of curiosity about the culture and history behind it. I do also want to briefly mention that under the Main Street train station, there is a small exhibit that provides information about historic travel by train, as well as context about the engines used on the Walt Disney World Railroad, which actually do date back to the early 1900s. Finally, to finish up Magic Kingdom, I do want to mention a few extinct attractions that were notable for their educational value. Mirroring Disneyland, Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland opened with its own version of Rocket to the Moon, but in 1975, both versions were replaced with Mission to Mars, which essentially updated the concept with better effects. You would first start in a pre-show where you looked out into a firing room full of animatronic technicians that are preparing your flight. After a bit of exposition, you're led out into a hallway that leads to your rocket, which recycles the circular theater and essentially has you do the same thing, except this time you travel to Mars. As you move around the planet, the ride uses this time to provide exposition and facts, discussing the planet's history and natural features. It's not a lot, but it's not boring either, and while the ride was outdated, with both versions closing in the early 90s, I do very much appreciate the informative experience dressed up in so much theater. Moving to a different area of Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland though, I should quickly mention If You Had Wings, which was an Omnimover attraction that took you on a tour through Central and South America, advertising various destinations from Eastern Airlines, which was the sponsor of the ride. It may not appear educational by today's standards, but as it opened in 1973 in the pre-internet age, I do think there was value in wanting to get people interested in experiencing other countries and culture. The ride closed in 1989 and reopened the same year as Delta Dreamflight, obviously sponsored by Delta. While it reused the same track layout and vehicles, this ride instead briefly teaches you about the history of aviation and how it relates to travel. It was still clearly a corporate advertisement, but I do at least appreciate the educational aspect, and really, I think it was expected at the time. I won't go into these rides in any more depth because I've already covered them in a dedicated video, but with Delta Dreamflight in particular, it seemed very much to follow in the footsteps of the many corporate sponsored rides of Epcot Center. While up to this point, Disneyland and Magic Kingdom have not necessarily been the most explicitly educational, Epcot was, from the start, conceived with that goal in mind, which really is the starting point for widespread education in the parks. What made early Epcot so exceptional wasn't just its incredible attraction design, but also that it was created to both educate and inspire you about the future of humanity. Attractions in Future World such as Spaceship Earth and World of Motion were mostly made up of the history of communication and transportation respectively, ending in vague but optimistic scenes of the future, never making specific predictions, but instead wanting to inspire you to help build that better world. The Universe of Energy, while essentially a corporate advertisement on oil, still packed a lot of educational material into the full 45-minute experience, helped of course by the inclusion of dinosaurs. While the name changed, Living with the Land to this day still manages to make the future of farming interesting, and Kitchen Cabaret managed to get audiences interested in nutrition, or at least got them thinking about it because the show was just so weird. The Living Seas educated audiences on ocean science, while attempting to immerse them in an exciting underwater laboratory, and Journey into Imagination explored the arts, conveying tones of surreal, terror, fun, and ultimately inspiration, tying imagination into the pursuit of science. Finally, while Horizons was more science fiction than fact, although it did briefly cover a history of futurism, it worked more as a thesis statement for the park, tying all of the different subjects of Future World together into an optimistic vision of where humanity could go. It may have been light on the educational elements, but as we've discussed with some of the attractions of Disneyland and Magic Kingdom, it at least sparked curiosity, hoping to inspire a new generation of people to grow up in the pursuit of a better future. While I would like to go into more depth about what these rides entailed, I once again have an older video where I did exactly that, explaining away the myth of outdated Epcot. I highly encourage you to check that video out if you're not familiar with early Epcot, because it may have been the most interesting park ever built, but if there's one place it was outdated, it was with the various exhibits. In the center of the park was Communicore, which was filled with displays and shows that showcased technology and how it would affect humanity going forward. The same applied with many of the pavilions, having many post-show areas for their rides, with exhibits that had a much more specific focus on their particular subject. Many of these exhibits, including the ones in Communicore, did actually outdate themselves because of that focus on actual technology, but from conception, the park was also built with the intention to update this as needed. When Michael Eisner became CEO in 1984, he didn't do much with Epcot until the 1989 introduction of the Wonders of Life, or the Health Pavilion, but Communicore was eventually updated into Innoventions, delivering on that promise of keeping the park relevant. Now granted, much of this was strange and misguided, as the initial Innovention space was focused on video games, and the overall transformation of Future World into a zany postmodern aesthetic specific to the 90s seemed like a strange fit. Still, exhibits were updated to retain their educational value, and at their peak, was actually more dense and available offerings than Communicore ever was. Likewise, pavilion exhibits were also updated, although in some cases this was a downgrade. Reportedly though, Eisner found Epcot to be unexciting. He correctly recognized that thrill rides were needed, and did introduce Test Track as a replacement for World of Motion in 1999, which while boisterous in tone and thrill, did make a genuine effort to fit the theme of Epcot. Its queue was dense with information relating to automobiles, and the ride continued the transportation theme by taking you through a series of tests in a manufacturing plant. While it lost the broader education of World of Motion, I do think that since the United States is such a car-centric society, the actual automobile focus of the ride was a great fit as a more focused aspect of the theme of transportation. Currently, American society seems to be moving towards a desire for public transportation, but the theme of Test Track fits the era it was built in. While a bit more controversial, the next big Eisner project for Epcot was Mission Space, which, almost like a spiritual successor to Mission to Mars, sent you to the Red Planet. The context was different, as the ride acknowledges that it's a simulator and that you're experiencing the G-forces of astronaut training, but despite its intensity, it is an interesting idea. It was less educational about Mars or space travel because it focused more on the training aspect, but at least it fit the theme of Epcot. Eisner's version of the park, which I did enjoy, was a very mixed experience though. You had the incredible hit of Test Track, but then duds like the re-theme of Journey into Imagination, or the mixed experiences like Mission Space, which alienated too many park guests just through its sheer intensity. From the beginning, World Showcase was always intended to be a cultural experience, building pavilions with iconography from their respective countries, and always intending to be explicitly educational. This was achieved through the merchandise that was sold, sometimes authentic, sometimes not, and Disney even hired through an international program to staff the pavilions with people from their respective countries, allowing them to share their own experiences and facts about where they're from. Food, of course, is a large element of the different countries, and while early Epcot restaurants were not perfect, they at least tried. Outside of a few select restaurants today, the food in World Showcase is mostly just American food with an international flair, but at the very least, this probably leads to people exploring other culinary options outside of Disney. The many film attractions throughout their respective pavilions are educational as well, and while World Showcase was intended to open with more technically complicated shows and attractions, at the very least we have the American Adventure. If you've watched me for a while, then you'll probably know that while I find this show technically impressive, its writing is outdated to the point where it appears insensitive, waving away darker moments in American history with an almost comedic flair through unrelenting nationalism and tonally inappropriate line delivery. Still, I can appreciate what it's trying to do for the era it was built in, and I wish that World Showcase would have gotten similar planned shows that related to Japan and to Equatorial Africa. In terms of explicit education, a few pavilions do have museum-like displays, and the Mexico Pavilion opened with El Rio del Tiempo, or the River of Time. I've always liked the initial scene of this ride, taking you on a quiet, mysterious, and foreboding journey past an Aztec pyramid as a volcano erupts in the background. On your right, you'll experience the distinct sounds of utensils scratching against dinner plates from the adjacent restaurant, but it only adds to the intrigue as you enter an Aztec stone tunnel away from the present. Traveling through, this initial scene opens up into large sets that frame screens, with each representing a different aspect of Aztec culture and tradition. Moving forward, the ride brings you into the colonial era of Mexico, which through an art style reminiscent of It's a Small World, you witness the celebration of the Day of the Dead. Finally, the boats move into contemporary Mexico, which showcases recreational activities among the country's beautiful geography, and from here transitions to a market scene, and finally to Mexico City, where you encounter a celebration of the country and its people. Unfortunately, the ride was rethemed into the Grand Fiesta Tour in 2007, removing the educational aspects on screen and instead adding Donald, Jay, and Panchito, who cause chaos throughout the ride. While the bones of the original are mostly intact, I think it's telling that in the Iger era, the idea behind the new version was to remove the educational aspect and instead just bombard you with loud stimulation. You might recall that in the intro, I stated that Disney leadership does not currently trust you to enjoy something without a character slapped onto it, and this makes for a really good example. Moving on though, while many pavilions and attractions for World Showcase were never built, which really is sad because many of them would likely be classics today, the Norway Pavilion did manage to open in 1988 under Eisner. The standout of course was the thrilling boat ride, Maelstrom, which briefly took you through medieval Norse history, but abruptly dumped you into a swamp full of mythological creatures, including a threatening three-headed troll. Through the short ride course, you encountered elements of Norway through time, including polar bears, colonial-era ships, and finally a contemporary oil rig, which was an industry that 1980s Norway really wanted to emphasize. On concluding the ride, you exit into a Norse village and watch a short film advertising the highlights of the country, its people, and industry. Maelstrom was a weird attraction, one that felt underbaked and disjointed, but I at least appreciate its unique theme and the history that it covers. It's certainly better than Frozen Ever After, which I've spent countless videos pointing out has almost nothing to do with Norway other than inspiring the setting of the film, and I think also clearly reinforces my point about intellectual property destroying and replacing actual culture and education in the parks. Getting away from the criticism for a moment though, I do want to highlight how important Epcot was in elevating Disney parks into something beyond just entertainment. While Disneyland and Magic Kingdom were both great, with their theming and experiences outshining any other park anywhere else in the world for their time, their educational aspects were minimal and instead were just focused on the fantasy of different popular genres of story. What Epcot did for Disney was not just break the mold of the castle park, but it became something that was much more meaningful, intending to inspire generations of Americans to build a better future and learn about other nations and cultures that were unlike their own. Epcot wasn't just transparently educational, but it was built with the assumption that audiences would enjoy this type of park. I think this assumption is correct, because while Epcot has been parodied for its educational aspect, and many non-parks people have complained because there weren't enough characters to point at, the park was undeniably popular and made a serious impression on so many people who could respect a park that was trying to do something so unique. More importantly though, Disney parks for the next 2 decades were highly educational going forward, which is clearly the result of the success of early Epcot Center. If you're watching this video, then you've probably seen others that I've produced, many of which have told the story of Disney MGM Studios. To quickly summarize, Universal monetized its studio in Hollywood through a tram tour in 1964, which in addition to bringing tourists through the real working studio, included demonstrations of behind-the-scenes movie magic, which then evolved through the next few decades into complex shows and attractions. In the early 80s, Universal expressed interest in wanting to build a working studio and tram tour in Florida to capitalize off of the Orlando tourist market developed by Walt Disney World, and Michael Eisner then became the head of Disney, announcing their own Florida studio and park to drive Universal out. That's of course a fascinating story full of drama that created the highly competitive tourist market that we see in Orlando today, but sticking with the theme of this video, we should of course point out how Disney MGM was highly educational in the experiences it offered. It initially opened with Hollywood Boulevard as its equivalent of Main Street USA, and while it didn't go out of its way to teach anything, its buildings are certainly based off of real Southern California landmarks that have a lot of significant history behind them. It's definitely an interesting expression that pulls from real culture that celebrates a mythologized golden age of Hollywood, and when Sunset Boulevard opened in 1994, the theme and reverence continued to the buildings there as well. You've probably also heard the story of the Great Movie Ride, which started out conceptually as a film pavilion for Epcot, but evolved into the anchor attraction and thesis statement of Disney MGM Studios. The premise was pretty straightforward from the name, taking park guests through famous but also genre-defining movies, films that weren't just popular, but were considered artistically significant for the time that they debuted. Walking into a recreation of the Chinese theater, riders entered a Hollywood set and boarded large vehicles that were guided by a cast member, who would provide facts and exposition about the films you would travel through, but also provided commentary as events played out around you. The experience was incredibly clever, as it started off by taking you through 3 classic Hollywood musicals, Footlight Parade, Singin' in the Rain, and Mary Poppins. Perhaps including a Disney film like this might seem a bit heavy-handed in a ride celebrating film more broadly, but Mary Poppins was certainly a technical marvel, and is important to the history of Disney's film library. Moving on, the guide notes the seedy city that you're transitioning into, and you pass by a small scene from The Public Enemy. However, you're held up by a traffic light, and coming to a stop, a mobster played by another cast member would come out, shooing your guide out of the vehicle. Suddenly, a car drives out and a shootout occurs with riders caught right in the middle, and the mobster who threatened the guide jumps in, jacking the vehicle and moving forward. In this next scene, which is a mashup of different references from various Western films, something similar happens where you stop in the town and are caught in the middle of another conflict. However, depending on how many vehicles were running during the day, and depending on which one you were seated in, your guide might have stayed with you through the gangster scene, and was instead thrown out of the vehicle by an outlaw here, which, if that's the case, the scene was more complex, and involved a pyro effect, where dynamite was thrown into the bank. As you escape through a door from the Western shootout, you move into a quiet, disconcerting segment inside a space station. Depending on who's driving, whether it's the gangster or the outlaw, they'll have different themed reactions going forward. Moving further through the scene, narration from the vehicle confirms that you're entering the terror of Ridley Scott's Alien, and as you progress, you'll see an animatronic figure of Ellen Ripley hiding from the xenomorph as its saliva drips through the vents above. Continuing on, the vehicle comes to a stop and riders are startled as one bursts out of the ceiling and another, disguised in the ship's walls, attacks from the side. Quickly moving out, the ride vehicle now passes through the resting place of the Ark from Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Moving further in, you park near a statue of Anubis as your guide notices a large jewel, and in their greed, they leave the vehicle to acquire it. A hooded figure played by another cast member warns them against it, but it's too much to resist, and through a smoke effect and a rotating wall, it appears as if your nefarious character has been cursed, burned down to just their skeleton. The hooded figure reveals themselves to be your original guide, and taking a bow, returns to your vehicle to restart the tour. From here, riders travel through a small segment about horror films, before then traveling into the 1932 MGM-produced version of Tarzan. The tour then travels forward into a scene from Casablanca, and then rounds a bend through the Sorcerer's Apprentice scene from Fantasia, which I do think counts as another artistically significant Disney film and isn't too self-serving. Finally, you encounter Munchkinland from The Wizard of Oz, and another thrilling scene plays out as the Munchkins are interrupted by the Wicked Witch of the West. After interacting with riders, blaming them for the death of her sister, the guide convinces her that they're innocent, and having just narrowly escaped her wrath as she disappears into a cloud of smoke, the Munchkins start singing, guiding you out of the scene down the yellow brick road. Moving through the woods, you pass by one last scene where you encounter Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion, before then pulling into a final room where you watch a brief film. It had changed over the course of the ride to keep it updated, but it essentially showcases various classic films, compiling them into an inspirational segment that celebrates the discipline as art. After this segment concludes, the vehicles then return to the station. It's clear that while the Great Movie Ride employed a lot of popular films, it had a message beyond just letting people view their favorite things. An issue that you often saw towards the end of the ride before it closed in 2017 was that a shallower Disney crowd often complained that they didn't know what the movies were because they were old. It's annoying to me that anyone like that could express themselves and be expected to be taken seriously, because the point of the ride was not to have you there to point at iconography and shout, "Hey, I know that thing," but obviously to showcase and immerse you into films that have contributed artistically to cinema. When I first experienced this as a young kid, I certainly wasn't familiar with most of the films, but it didn't matter because its meaning was pretty clear and exposed me to many Hollywood classics, which I would count as an educational experience. Outside of the golden age of Hollywood theming, Disney MGM was actually outright educational as well. In the earliest years of the park, the Studio Backlot Tour was originally a 2-hour experience and loaded near the animation building. Once the tram set off, you passed through a tunnel that allowed you a glimpse into the costume and prop shops, which then led out to the backlot. Here you would pass through Residential Street, which had houses used in a few films and television shows. Traveling around, you would also spot props used in various productions, and towards the end of the tram route, you then moved into a set known as Catastrophe Canyon. This brought you up alongside a stuck gas tanker, which, after a storm that is achieved through water sprayers overhead, erupts into fire and slides down the rockwork as a flash flood occurs. Moving on, you see it reset and pass by the pumps in the back, giving you insight into a bit of movie magic. Finally, the tour moves through a series of city facades known as the Streets of America, and while they were real and were used for filming, this was quickly dropped from the tour after overwhelming demand for the park required it to be opened up so that guests had more space to spread out. On reaching the end of the tram portion, riders then transitioned to the walking segment of the tour, which first brought them to the water special effects tank, allowing the crowd and a few lucky participants to take part in filming a World War II naval battle. At its conclusion, the tour continued inside a soundstage known as the Special Effects Workshop, providing insight into the effects that were more difficult to achieve, such as stop-motion animation, or another audience participation segment that makes it appear as if volunteers are being carried by a giant bee. The tour then continued through different buildings and segments, sometimes allowing visitors the lucky chance to view sets or even productions currently filming, and concluded with a demonstration of editing and audio replacement. While not much actual filming occurred inside the park because it really wasn't ideal, A lot of the production of the Backlot tour either had to be cut or just simply made up to look like there was actual work going on. The walking portion of the tour didn't last long, and the water tank was eventually reworked into a long pre-show experience for a reduced tram portion, but at the very least, I appreciate that the park genuinely wanted to educate people about film production. The educational element wasn't just relegated to the tour though, as you could find plenty of studio theming throughout the rest of the park, and shows such as the Indiana Jones Stunt Spectacular, Lights Motors Action, and a few others provided educational insight into other various aspects of the movie-making process. Of course, I can't forget to mention the magic of Disney Animation, which was a real animation studio that originally played a smaller role in Disney Animation, but eventually moved on to bigger productions, primarily animating Mulan, Lilo and Stitch, and Brother Bear, and would allow guests to move through the building on a tour, letting them see the animators as they worked. While we might look back at early Epcot as the educational park, and it certainly was, Disney MGM Studios was just as focused on learning, which I think gets lost because it wasn't as high concept. Still, there was a lot of value there, and I think it's telling that Eisner continued that educational mission established by Epcot when moving forward with new projects. In 1996, the Disney Village Resort was converted into the Disney Institute, which repurposed the old villas and built a new central complex, which was equipped to handle classes of various subjects. Reportedly inspired by Eisner's experience at the Chautauqua Institution in New York, which offers programs on the arts, education, and recreational activities, the Disney Institute was very much the same, anticipating the Walt Disney World resort guests would opt for a different kind of vacation, where they could leisurely take classes and spend time engaging in recreational and fitness activities. During the course of their stay, resort guests could pack their itinerary with multiple classes, and the resort offered 80 different programs on opening, with subjects ranging from wine tasting, to learning hand-drawn animation, to gardening, to computer classes, to cooking, to photography, to the performance arts, and it just goes on and on. The Institute offered a world-class gym and spa, as well as opportunities for outdoor sports and recreational activities such as kayaking, golf, and rock climbing. The actual complex was equipped with 28 studios, both an indoor and outdoor theater, a TV station, a radio station, and a cinema, allowing visitors to try their hand at a wide variety of activities and subjects in the arts and media production. When the Disney Institute was conceptualized, it was done with the assumption that there was a demographic out there that would pay to enjoy high-quality but leisurely classes that would help you build new skills, or at the very least expose you to new disciplines or hobbies that you were unfamiliar with. I really do like the idea behind this, and again, reveals an old attitude from Disney where they not only believed that learning was fun and enriching, but could itself be a major draw to Walt Disney World. Unfortunately, the Disney Institute closed in 2002, and after demolishing the villas and constructing new buildings, it reopened as Saratoga Springs in 2004, with the Disney Institute brand evolving to become a corporate education program. While the idea behind the resort was laudable, I think that the pricing system and the vacationing demographic just didn't mix very well. Epcot and Disney MGM were clearly educational in their approach to entertainment, but the park experience is just so much more than hobby and recreational classes, and for the price, which ranged from $430 to $1,300 depending on your length of stay and number of programs you signed up for, the majority of people were always going to choose the theme parks. That's not to say that it didn't have an audience and would probably have done well in upper-class suburbs in another state, but if you're traveling to Orlando, you're likely going specifically for theme parks and adjacent themed entertainment. Still, the thought behind the Disney Institute was an interesting experiment, and perhaps it could have been successful with more tweaking or a different attempt at marketing. It's also worth noting that from 1974 up through 1999, Disney had a small animal exhibit in the middle of Bay Lake known as Discovery Island, which allowed visitors to essentially explore a small zoo filled mostly with exotic birds. I do think that zoos are inherently educational, or at least gets people curious enough to learn about animals on their own time, but the Disney Institute actually had photography classes that went to the island, reportedly even after it closed to most of the public. The reason for the closure was, well, if you haven't guessed, the opening of Animal Kingdom in 1998. Now, of course, just the animals alone were an educational element of the park, and the animal trails have cast members stationed around, ready to provide facts and stories about them. However, Animal Kingdom is so much more, having a cultural and artistic depth that explores humankind's relationship to animals, whether through the architecture of the park's hubland, appropriately named Discovery Island, or with animals of legend, such as with the Yeti on Expedition Everest, or the once grand plans for Beastly Kingdom, a land based on animals and mythology. While I usually have issues with IP in the parks replacing art and attractions that draw from culture, even Pandora fits in the spirit of Beastly Kingdom, exploring a contemporary but almost mythological science fiction story about our relationship with animals and the environment. The park often presents this information in a forthright manner, whether it's discussing keystone species in Flight of Passage, Kilimanjaro safaris once having a storyline about the danger of poaching, or a message about environmental destruction in both Everest and Kali River Rapids. Of course, Animal Kingdom explores human relationships to animals of the past with Dinoland USA, which does a lot of environmental storytelling to flesh out an American town obsessed with dinosaurs. While the average person passes through the land and pays it no mind, if you look throughout, you'll discover so much silly kitsch, relating to how human relationships with dinosaurs, or at least their presentation through toys, movies, and other avenues, has been since their discovery. With the premiere of Jurassic Park in 1993, its technical effects were now capable of presenting the creatures in a new horrific light. While the movie makes a point to treat them as animals acting instinctively, they were still certainly scary. With Jurassic Park the Ride having opened in Universal Hollywood in 1996, and an entire land coming to Islands of Adventure in 1999, it's clear that Disney wanted to develop their own competing and high-intensity dinosaur attraction for Dinoland, contrasting with the kitsch of the rest of the land. Countdown to Extinction, or Dinosaur as it's now called, is fantastically intense, and actually still does employ those silly kitsch elements, especially in the pre-show, so it's disappointing to see Disney currently threatening to remove it, instead wanting more brand integration with Indiana Jones. Dinoland is in trouble not necessarily because of its kitsch theme, but rather because of a poor Eisner-era decision in 2002, expanding capacity in the park by building Chester and Hester's Dino-Rama, literally expanding the land with a dinosaur-themed roadside carnival. It's a really clever way to build on the land's story and theming on the cheap, but most park-goers don't understand its significance, and so it detracts from the land rather than contributing to it. An interesting attraction that most people don't know existed in the early park was the Dinosaur Jubilee, a temporary tent structure that opened with the park where Chester and Hester's sits today. Inside were real fossils of prehistoric creatures on loan from the Black Hills Institute and Treebold Paleontology, and in addition to the educational signs, cast members dressed up as interns from the Dino Institute would walk around, giving informative but comedic tours. Nearby was another temporary attraction, the Fossil Preparation Lab, which employed real paleontologists to dig out and clean up pieces of a T-Rex fossil discovered in 1990. Named Sue after her discovery by Sue Hendrickson, the fossil was acquired by the Chicago Field Museum in 1997, with pieces being sent to the attraction in Animal Kingdom, where park guests could actually see it being dug out and cleaned up for presentation before being shipped back to the museum. From the fossil, 3 replicas of the skeleton were produced, one of which still stands in Dinoland today, or at least it does at the time of making this video. These attractions were temporary, which is unfortunate, because there was real education here, and if not for Chester and Hester's Dino-Rama, I have a feeling that Dinoland wouldn't be in such bad shape today. To finish up Animal Kingdom, I want to take a look at Rafiki's Planet Watch, which I feel is both underrated but also underdeveloped as an attraction. From Africa, you'll enter the Harambe train station, which is a themed extension of the land, and even the train itself fits into the story. However, once you board, you take a pleasant 3-minute ride through the woods, and eventually you approach billboards that advertise Disney's most recent nature documentaries. Traveling further, it's clear that you've left the African theming as the train provides a glimpse backstage of the animal care facilities, where if you're lucky, you might actually spot something like a rhino or an elephant. Traveling further, a short clearing in the trees teases an animal mural off in the distance, and now arriving at Conservation Station, you're met with more posters advertising Disney documentaries. On leaving the station, you take a short trail through Habitat Habit, a series of signs and small exhibits related to educating you on creating sustainable habitats in your own backyard. It's pretty barren. In pre-2020, there were actually animal exhibits along this pathway, with cast members who provided information about them, which leads me to believe that this area is living on borrowed time. At the end of the path, if you turn to your left, you'll encounter a small butterfly garden, and turning to your right, you'll see Conservation Station, a large building with an elaborate animal mural flanking its entrance, which you may have spotted from the train. On entering inside, the art piece continues and leads out into an atrium, which I enjoy viewing because it very much gives off a 90s science museum impression. Walking along the perimeter of the atrium, a hallway brings you through this functional animal care facility, allowing you to look behind the scenes, which includes an examination room for animal checkups. Moving further, you move past a series of rooms with smaller animal exhibits surrounded by educational signs, covering various amphibians, reptiles, insects, and arachnids. The final room is dedicated to information on animal nutrition in the park, and being let back out into the atrium, you have two other options to explore. One is another small exhibit advertising the Disney Conservation Fund, with displays relating the importance of environmental research and preservation, providing a bit of insight into what the fund actually does. In the past, a large part of the atrium was for character meet and greets or interactions with animals that were handled by qualified cast members. However, a large area was sectioned off in 2019, becoming the animation experience. Here, under the guidance of an artist, park guests are given materials to draw Disney animal characters, which I find distasteful because it comes at the expense of meeting actual animals up close. Conservation Station also has an attraction closed off, which used to be known as Song of the Rainforest. Inside these rooms, now blocked off by potted plants, you would wear headphones while sitting in darkness, listening to the sounds of a rainforest and a narration that explains the importance of rainforest conservation. It wasn't particularly interesting, so no big loss, but it's another element of education that was removed from the park. Leaving the building from the back, you'll emerge out into Affection Section, a petting zoo that naturally seems to be wildly popular with really young kids. Here you'll find mostly goats, but also the occasional cow, sheep, or pigs. Like the rest of Animal Kingdom, the area is patrolled by helpful cast members who provide information and stories about the animals. So that wraps up Rafiki's Planet Watch, a name for this land that covers the train station, the Habitat Habit Trail, and Conservation Station. While there's not much to do back here, I do appreciate its 90s museum aesthetic, and is a fun air-conditioned diversion that allows you to see some smaller animals. Still, existing as a shell of its former self, it's a reminder of an Animal Kingdom that once prided itself on education, and while much of the park's thematic integrity has remained intact for now, it's really only a matter of time until Iger comes in and starts destroying the great educational work and culture of the Eisner era. Even this far into the video, I feel as if I've discussed a lot, but still haven't really scratched the surface of what there is to cover. I think about Casey's Corner in the Magic Kingdom, based off of an animated Disney short known as Casey at the Bat, which itself is based off of a poem of the same name from 1888. While technically an IP tie-in, there's a larger history of American baseball culture behind that, and it's certainly reflected in the theming of the restaurant. I also think back to Communicore and Innoventions, both of which you could dedicate entire multi-hour videos to on just covering the many exhibits inside. This in turn reminds me of the Millennium Village, a temporary venue set up at World Showcase for Epcot's Millennium Celebration, with even more interactive exhibits and cultural ambassadors that teach you about their countries. Disney hotels often have cultural depth too, with Pop Century's different themed sections drawing from popular consumer culture of their assigned decades, which I find immensely interesting. The Grand Californian has many callbacks to California history found throughout, and visiting Animal Kingdom Lodge, the resort doesn't just display real art from various nations in Africa, but also employs many cultural ambassadors from the continent who often love to share their experiences and culture. And you know what? All of these premiered under Eisner. Circling back around to the beginning of the video, I hope that you better understand my position on why I think that California Adventure could have been great, and why its thematic inspiration was so interesting. I've established that from the start, Disney parks incorporated education, and even where they didn't, often drew from culture in an interesting, significant way. Epcot became the catalyst that brought education into the parks on a meaningful, broad scale, and despite people not remembering it as such, the original Disney MGM Studios was highly educational over the course of its life, until 2014 when it closed the tram tour and started its transformation into the park you see now. Animal Kingdom 2 continued that educational tradition, but also had elevated themes of conservation and human-animal culture, and of course, the Disney Institute was a really interesting experiment, challenging guests to think of vacation differently. From this precedent, I look at the lightly educational elements of early California Adventure, wishing that the park had gotten a better budget and better themed lands that celebrated the landscapes, history, and people of California, which could have been immensely interesting. While I appreciate what was there, it was still so much lost potential, and the park has transformed for the worst, becoming a billboard for Disney brands on a lot of underdeveloped, or at least thematically incorrect attractions. Throughout many of my videos, I've pointed out how Cars Land is fantastic in a vacuum, but it's set in Arizona, and I can't get over how awful Avengers Campus, Pixar Pier, and now San Francisco are. Leadership keeps dumping intellectual property into the park, but I think wonders why their attendance isn't getting any better, and to me, I think it's because it suffers from a lack of meaning. That's what made Disney parks shine so well in the past, not just because each park had an interesting cohesive theme with attractions that fit into it, but also because Disney used to have depth, drawing from culture and often having that educational angle. The strength of the castle parks has always been fantasy, so I see why many of those elements are not necessary for their success, but when I look at Epcot, I see a dead shell of a once great park. Its original attractions were legendary, but many mistakes were made in the Eisner era and only made worse now under Iger, converting the park into another platform of brand synergy. While building another Space Mountain in the park is certainly fun, by slapping the Guardians of the Galaxy onto it, this only continues to erode the educational and cultural value that Epcot once had, which cheapens what would otherwise be a great coaster layout. You've probably heard that this is a revived project from the Eisner era for a roller coaster themed around the Big Bang and energy, which I think would resonate just as well and would actually bring meaning to the park. Of course, the lack of meaning as an issue is present all over the park now, from other shallow IP brand attractions, to removing many shows and experiences, to serving American food almost all over World Showcase. Disney's Hollywood Studios, which was renamed in 2008, has serious issues with this as well. While both versions of the park might seem about movies on the surface, the juxtaposition behind the early, highly educational park and the current brand synergy machine is a pretty drastic contrast when you think about it. The Great Movie Ride celebrated cinema and the films that defined it, and yet Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway has you flying through an empty warehouse as projections play on the walls. It just doesn't resonate the same way, even if people find it adequately fun. Disney MGM Studios was not perfect, but at least its studio theme tied all of its attractions together into a cohesive and educational experience, something that the current park fails to do with Toy Story Land and Galaxy's Edge, purposefully going out of its way to remove the thematic glue that would have made this all work. And Animal Kingdom? I think the idea behind Pandora is absolutely insane, but it was salvaged and incorporated properly into the park's theme, guided by Joe Rohde and his team. Now though, Animal Kingdom is about to suffer like all the other parks, removing one of Disney's most interesting lands in favor of another IP mashup, rather than choosing to fix the issues or enhance and maintain what is already there. While education and cultural depth in the Disney parks is still there if you look for it, much of it has been destroyed under the IP mandate, working under the assumption that park guests are dumb and shallow, only capable of engaging with brands at a superficial level. That's incredibly frustrating to watch because I think I've made it clear how interesting Disney parks have been in the past, and while education is not necessarily an avenue to success, as with the failure of the Disney Institute, it certainly played a core role in the Eisner era, only really disappearing after California Adventure, and much of it having now been removed under Iger. The point I'm making is that while intellectual property is not a negative thing on its own, and can actually be great if the right time, money, and care is put into it, the mandate has largely been to the detriment of the Disney experience, sometimes to a laughably awful degree. Disney parks used to be so much more than just brand synergy machines, and they resonated culturally because they were an elevated experience, trusting you to be more than just a mindless consumer that was averse to anything that wasn't a familiar brand. It's of course disappointing, and while executives don't see it, I think it has built up a good degree of resentment from consumers who realize that they are now getting a hollow corporate experience. I hope that this video was informative, educating, or at least reminding you of the excellence of Disney parks and what was lost. To conclude, if you found this video valuable, I think it's important to influence the narrative and culture of the parks fandom, and one easy way to help this gain more exposure is by just simply leaving a like if you haven't yet done so. As always though, if you enjoy videos like these and would like to see more, I recommend hitting the subscribe button and bell notification so as to be alerted to new videos as they release.